This is John Immerwahr, and welcome to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Today we'll use the museum's collection to take us on a journey of European art from the medieval world, with works from 1125 to 1319, to the Renaissance with art from the 1400s and the 1500s. First, just a bit about myself. I'm not an art historian, and I'm not an employee of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But I have learned a lot about the museum from various museum programs. We'll begin with an overview of our journey by looking at two works, starting with this late medieval Italian painting by Pietro Lorenzetti in 1319. Here we see the Virgin Mary and her son Jesus. Now, let's jump 180 years to the end of our journey with a Renaissance work by Pinturicchio. It's another scene of Mary and Jesus. Both works, of course, are religious art. Especially in the medieval world, the church is the major patron of art, so much of the art we'll see today will be religious art. But they're very different, and the differences tell us a lot about our journey from the medieval world to the Renaissance. First, let's talk about the backgrounds. In Lorenzetti, the background is gold, suggesting that Mary and Jesus are in heaven. The pattern on Mary's dress was also painted in gold. Imagine what this would look like in shimmering candlelight. Above them, we see two angels who are in heaven with them. In the Pinturicchio painting, Mary and Jesus aren't in heaven, but here in our world, with trees and building in the background. Now, let's look at the other people in the paintings. First, look at this little figure here. He's probably the monk who paid for the painting for his church, and he's also much smaller than Mary and Jesus, because he's only human, while they're divine beings in heaven. The size of the figures denotes their importance. Here, there are some smaller people and smaller buildings, but they're small not because they are less important, but because they're far away. The artist wants to make his painting like a window to a scene that we could actually see. Now let's look at Jesus. In Lorenzetti's picture, he looks like an adult. He might be the age of a baby, but he's also God, not like a normal human baby. He already knows everything he needs to know. Here, Jesus looks much like a human child, and Mary is teaching him to read. Even though he's God and he's probably the smartest kid in the class, he's a human child and he has to learn to read. So how can we describe the difference? Lorenzetti takes a natural scene, a mother and a child, and puts it in a spiritual world, emphasizing their difference from us. The painting is a gateway that takes us into heaven. We worship these figures because they're so far above us. Pinturicchio does something very different. He takes the holy figures and shows us a more human side of them, where Jesus needs to learn to read just as we did. His goal is to make these figures more human, more like us, so we can relate to them. So, let me make a rough generalization. Medieval art often takes something from our world and spiritualizes it. In the Renaissance, the artists sometimes take the spiritual world and seek to humanize it. Now, let me say something about how to enjoy this kind of art. When you're in a museum, maybe the least helpful thing you can say about something you see is this: I don't like it. Because that assumes your likes and dislikes are fixed and never change. But think how often you met somebody you didn't like, and now that person is a good friend. When I saw this picture, at first I might have said, I don't like it, because it looks strange to me. Here's another mother and child picture that I really didn't like the first time I saw it. It's by Vincent van Gogh in 1888. But after I spent some time with all three of these paintings and learned a bit about them, I came to appreciate them all, each in its own way. So here's my tip. When you see something in a museum, repress your urge to think what you like or don't like. Instead, if you see something strange to you, think, I don't get it, and say, some smart people put this in a museum for me to see. What was it they thought was so great about it? And maybe, after a while, you'll begin to get it. Now, let's continue our visit to the world of medieval art. Let's start our medieval tour in the museum's Great Stair Hall. When the museum was built in 1928, the first director believed that people needed to see art in the environments that produced it. So he sent his agents all over the world to purchase historical rooms and structures, which were then taken apart, shipped to Philadelphia, and reconstructed here in the museum. There are over 30 of these environments in the museum. One of the most famous is this medieval cloister with stones from a French monastery from the late 1200s. This open-air courtyard is the heart of a community where religious men would live, pray, and work. When you visit the museum, just come and sit for a while. It's so peaceful. This fountain is the center of the cloister garden, where the men could drink or wash, and they could pray while walking around in the sheltered walkway. Instead of a stone floor, imagine this whole area filled with fragrant herbs and plants. Notice these rounded arches held up by columns. They're called Romanesque arches because the Romans used them so widely, and buildings that use them are called Romanesque buildings. We'll talk more about them in a minute. If you look closely at the fountain, you'll see those same Romanesque arches as part of the decoration, and you might notice that the tops of the columns have carvings on them with religious symbols. They're hard to make out, so the museum has this white column from a similar cloister that's a bit easier to read. As you zoom in, we'll see this person in the middle has sinned by speaking ill of God or other sacred things, and now these demons are pulling his tongue out while he tries unsuccessfully to push them away. It's a warning about the sinful world outside the monastery. For the medieval monks, a cloister garden symbolized the Garden of Eden, a paradise with plants and flowing water, where humans lived before they sinned. By renouncing the sinful world, the monks can return to this small spiritual paradise. Just as this picture was one way to imagine heaven, being a monk was another way to become closer to heaven during this life. Medieval architects developed another remarkable way to infuse their world with spirituality. Walk out of the cloister and turn around, and you'll see this massive entryway to a French church from the 1100s with those rounded arches. These Romanesque buildings are beautiful, but they tend to have thick walls and very small windows. Now face the other direction, and you'll see a totally different kind of arch that is pointed rather than rounded. It's called a Gothic arch, and is typical of a huge engineering breakthrough that allowed the later medievals to build taller buildings that seemed to rise up to God, like this famous copy of a Gothic cathedral nearby us in Bryn Athyn, Pennsylvania. Go see it if you can. There are also some Romanesque-style buildings there as well, so you could compare. And you'll immediately notice all the pointed Gothic arches, like this large one in the front of the church. These arches create space for much bigger windows. Going back to the museum, you'll see that the museum has created a small Gothic chapel right next to the Gothic arch. And you'll see the arch windows in the chapel are filled with stained glass, like this one, where the pieces of colored glass have drawings on them and are held together with metal strips. The windows usually tell religious stories. For example, this tells the story of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, and the picture would be brilliantly illuminated by the sun. Glass was rare and expensive, so seeing this window would have been a breathtaking spiritual experience back in the medieval period. We've seen plasma screen TVs and 3D IMAX movies, but imagine what the experience would have been like for a medieval churchgoer, with the window illuminated in brilliant colors and the gold paintings literally dancing in reflected candlelight. When you go to Paris, be sure to see this medieval church, Sainte-Chapelle, and I promise you, no matter how many 3D IMAX movies you've seen, it will take your breath away also. Now let's turn to the art of the Renaissance. In what we saw already, I suggested that the medievals sometimes looked for ways to bring the spiritual world into our world. In the Renaissance, for many reasons, the direction sometimes goes the other way, with works that tend to make the spiritual world more human and perhaps more approachable. Let's start with this remarkable object. It's a reliquary, a decorated container designed to hold a relic, something associated with a saint during the saint's lifetime. Here, it held the skeleton of the arm of a bishop who died for his faith and was recognized as a saint after his death. Now, however, it's empty. There's no relic in it. Notice the beauty and accuracy of the hands. This gesture, with 3 fingers up and the ring and pinky finger curled under, is an important Christian gesture of blessing. So even in his death, the bishop is blessing us. Notice how different this hand is from the hand in the Lorenzetti picture. My sense is that Lorenzetti isn't particularly interested in giving Mary a perfect human hand. But a really believable hand would help believers feel that they're really in the presence of something associated with the saint, and to believe that as they venerate the relic of the saint will pray for them in heaven. Now let's look at some Renaissance painters from Northern Europe, the area that includes Holland and Belgium today, starting with this painting by Robert Campin from 1427. It's of Mary and Jesus. Once again, there's a gold background that reminds us of the Lorenzetti. But look how beautifully the painter has done the jewels and the halos. They look as though you could reach out and touch them. Yes, Mary and Jesus are in heaven, but this is a more physical heaven. Also note all of the naturalistic details in the figures, in their hair, their lips, and especially their very realistic hands. Notice that Mary is praying to Jesus. Because she's human like us, we have a connection to her, and she prays to Jesus for us. Because she's Jesus' mother, he is moved by her prayer and blesses us, using that same prayer gesture that we saw on the reliquary. But now, look at Jesus' left hand. He's reaching over the edge of the painting into our world. Mary's prayer has brought him into our world. Notice the tiny pendant that Jesus is wearing is reflecting a room, but it must be a room in our world. So in other words, because of Mary's humanity, she has brought Jesus down from the golden heaven into our human world. Jan van Eyck is another Northern European Renaissance artist. Here we see one of the most important saints, St. Francis. He has gone into the mountains to pray, and he has had a vision of a six-winged angel on a cross, evoking the crucifixion of Jesus. At that moment, his own hands and feet begin to bleed, exactly in the spots where Jesus had been nailed to the cross. Notice that Van Eyck has turned the feet at kind of a funny angle, so they don't quite line up with his body, presumably because he wants us to see that the feet are bleeding also. But rather than putting St. Francis in a golden heaven, he's in a world filled with plants and rocks, and these are real plants and rocks from nature. If you're a geology major, you'll notice this rock as limestone with some fossils in it, and this one with layers as sedimentary rock, and up here sandstone, and over here an igneous rock like granite. Why did Van Eyck do all of this? I believe it was because he felt that some of God's glory lived not just in heaven, but in the wonderful things of his creation, the rocks and plants and animals that are around us. And this mystical experience happened in our very real world. One other thing, this painting is tiny, only 5 inches square. It was painted using a tiny brush and a magnifying glass. You can't see most of the details we discussed. The museum has a large plasma screen next to it so you can blow up the image to see it. Amazing. Now let's talk about a very famous painting by Roger van der Weyden from 1460. These are 2 panels, each 6 feet high, and they would have been part of an altarpiece in the front of a church. On special days, the panels would have been open to reveal a scene inside that might have looked something like this, with carved figures in gold. This one that you're seeing is also in the museum, but it's from a different church. Most of the time, the panels would be closed, as you see them here. Notice that he connects them by showing how Mary's dress flows from one panel to the other. On the right side is Jesus at the moment of his death. The sky is turned black. Notice that the cross is almost the same color as the dark sky, so if you were in the back of the church, you wouldn't see the cross at all. It would look as though Jesus is flying up to heaven with the wind blowing up his garment. On the left, we see his mother Mary and one of his disciples, John the Evangelist. For a moment, compare it to a medieval crucifixion from the year 1285. Notice that in the medieval crucifixion, Jesus is in the center. Mary and John are much smaller, off to each side, and there's a tiny donor who paid for it, down by Jesus' feet. In the Van der Weyden, the 2 people, John and Mary, are the same size as Jesus, and Jesus is no longer in the center. They represent us and are an important part of the story as well. The artist also captures the human emotions. Look at Jesus' face. What was the last thing he saw before he died? His mother. And they look like mother and son. And like any mother who sees her son die, she's so overcome with grief that she's collapsed into the arms of John. If he weren't there, she'd be on the ground. But even though she is devastated, her hands show us that even in the midst of her grief, she has not lost her faith and is still praying to Jesus. And what about Jesus? If we look at his right hand, you'll see that same gesture of blessing that we have seen before in the reliquary. So at the darkest moments, at the death of Jesus, Mary is still praying to Jesus, and Jesus is still blessing us. So just as the Van der Weyden describes the crucifixion in terms of human emotions, the Van Eyck celebrates the richness of the world we live in. And the Campin picture shows us how our human connection to Mary brings Jesus from heaven into our world. Now let's leave Northern Europe and explore the Renaissance in Italy. If you went into an Italian church in the 1300s, you might have seen an altarpiece in the front of the church like this one. In the center is a large panel with Mary and Jesus, and then you see smaller panels on the side with pictures of various saints. The saints would typically have items that would help us identify them. For example, this is St. Mary Magdalene. She was said to have anointed Jesus' feet with oil, so she carries an oil jar, and she is supposed to have washed Jesus' feet and dried them with her hair, so she has long hair. Over here is St. Stephen, who was killed by people throwing stones at him. So on his head you can see the stones telling you that this is Stephen. Now let's jump almost 150 years ahead to a truly Renaissance altarpiece by Ghirlandaio from the 1490s. Again, we have Mary and Jesus in the center with saints on each side. Over here is St. Apollonia. She was tortured for her faith by having her teeth violently pulled out, and we see her holding these tongs with a tooth in them. If you look on the internet, you'll find quite a few dental clinics with names like the Apollonia Smile Center. Hopefully they don't practice the same kind of dentistry that was practiced on St. Apollonia. Here is St. Sebastian. He's easy to recognize because he always has arrows. He was a Roman soldier who was killed by being shot with arrows and then clubbed to death. Sometimes we see him actually getting shot with the arrows, but in other pictures we see him after his death. Here he is, after his death, holding an arrow, but protected by his very elegant armor. So much for similarities, but there are also some really important differences that are once again designed to make this whole scene more believable and more relatable. Notice again that this scene has a real background, not just the gold of heaven, so this is all happening in our world. And what is even more interesting is that the artist has used what's called one-point perspective to give the painting a sense of depth and believability. And notice that the focal point of the perspective is Jesus' hand, which is, of course, giving us that Christian gesture of blessing. Do you remember the halos that were perfectly round in some of the earlier paintings with the person's head right in the center? Now the halos are elliptical because, again, we're seeing them in perspective. All of this makes these figures look more lifelike so we can better identify with them. And notice that the saints are no longer stuck in their niches, as we saw in the earlier altarpiece, but these arches remind us of those separate panels, but the figures have stepped forward into our space, as though to invite us to join them. So here again, every effort is made to help us see these saints as real people in a real world. Now, look at baby Jesus. Yes, he blesses us with his right hand, and yes, he has red in his halo, indicating that he will die for us. But now, look at his left hand. He's playing with his toes, like any baby. So, in the words of the Renaissance, he is fully God and fully human. A God and yet a very human baby. As we move into the 1500s, we'll see some further developments in the Renaissance. As you walk through Gallery 350, you'll notice a number of these wonderful plates. They're 600 years old, and they look like you could have a meal on one and then pop it into the dishwasher. They were extremely expensive. Each one was hand-painted with a different scene. This reminds us that the Renaissance is a time of an enormous expansion of wealth through banking, trade, and early manufacturing. Now, instead of much of the art being made for churches, there are wealthy people who want beautiful things for their homes, like these plates and these handsome chests to store their clothing. Let's follow the theme of growing wealth with this picture by Dosso Dossi from the early 1500s. Again, we see Mary and baby Jesus, as we saw them in earlier altarpieces. This other baby here is Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. As an adult, he's often shown in animal skins with this long cross, so he has them even as a baby. Remember, every saint has a sign. Also notice that Jesus holds a goldfinch, a bird that was thought to have pulled the thorns from Jesus' head when he was on the cross. So this reminds us that Jesus will later die. We saw that same bird in this earlier altarpiece. Although there are similarities, there's also something very new here that has to do with the power of wealthy secular individuals. Do you remember that in earlier scenes, Jesus and Mary were surrounded by saints on either side? And remember the tiny figures of the donors, those people who actually paid for the medieval paintings. Those days are over. Those saints have been replaced by pictures of the people who paid for the painting. And they're huge, as big as Mary, and they're beautifully dressed. Dark clothing like what the man is wearing is especially expensive. It almost seems as if baby Jesus is talking to the man about that bird as though they're equals. Indeed, the human figures are much more important than poor Joseph back here. He might be Jesus' human father, and he has a halo, but we can hardly see him. Notice that the wife of the donor is kneeling on a little stool higher than the man, and that she has no shadow. That's surprising, since even the cat, a symbol of sensuality, has a shadow. The curators think that she may have died before the painting was done, which may be why she is higher and has no shadow. At any rate, the picture tells us that these are wealthy and important people, who even Jesus seems to take seriously. At the same time, some wealthy Renaissance people started to think perhaps, if you want a picture of yourself, just get someone to paint your portrait and skip Mary and Jesus. Like this portrait of a wealthy young gentleman done by Antonella da Messina, who was one of the earliest portrait painters. Our young friend also has dark clothing, but he wants us to know that his outer garment is fur-lined, and he has a blue shirt on underneath that. Notice also how the painter gives the painting a kind of animation with the eyes. The man was facing to our left, but when we came in the door, he turned his eyes to see us. Then his head followed his eyes, and then his shoulders also turned toward us. In a second, he will turn completely to face us. He recognizes us and gives us a slight smile. Although he's happy to see us, he doesn't want us to get too close. Perhaps we aren't as wealthy as he is. So at the bottom of the picture, you'll see this wooden barrier that separates it. It's not a picture frame. It's part of the picture and seems to put some distance between our friend and the outside world. This artist inspired other artists to paint portraits like this one, but you won't have a chance to take a selfie with it in the museum like these folks are doing because the painting's in Paris and it's one of the most famous paintings in the world. But you can see how Leonardo, who painted this Mona Lisa, might have been influenced by Antonella. Notice the same pose, turning the eyes to our left, with the head following, and the subtle smile. Now, let's go back to those plates. You might notice that they mostly have themes from mythology. Here's the death of Achilles. This is part of a tremendous growth of Renaissance interest in Greek and Roman art and mythology. We can see this interest in mythology in this picture of Cosimo, the Duke of Florence, painted by Bronzino in the 1500s. We think it might have been a gift for Cosimo's fiancée, who'd never actually seen him. But you might be wondering, why does the Duke have himself painted nude? Why is he holding a musical instrument? What's up with this dog here? And what is that fire up in the corner? Let's see if we can unpack some of those things. Usually in a painting from the 1500s, if a figure is nude, he or she probably wants to be portrayed as someone from mythology, like this other portrait by Bronzino in Milan, Italy. This man was an important admiral who wanted to be painted as Neptune, god of the sea, and so, just like the saints, Bronzino put in a trident, which is a code to let us know that he's associated with the god of the sea. In our picture, the code is the musical instrument, a lira da braccio, which is used to accompany singing and reciting of poetry. That suggests that Cosimo is comparing himself to Orpheus, the mythical singer and poet. and we would know that Orpheus has a beautiful wife who died, and that he went to the underworld to get her back. The underworld is guarded by a three-headed dog. We see one of the heads facing us and another turned to the side. Orpheus plays his music, charms the dogs, and follows the path to the underworld. He's allowed to bring her back, but he's told he must not turn his head to see if she's following. But he does turn his head at this odd angle. And don't try this at home, you'll need a chiropractor. And she goes back to the underworld forever. Now, Cosimo's the Duke of Florence, and he's not really going to be painted nude. So his artist studied a famous classical statue, which was so popular from prints that most educated people would know it. And he painted the statue's body, but photoshopped Cosimo's head on the statue's body. If you unfocus your eyes for a second, the head actually seems to float off the body, to remind everyone that this isn't really the Duke's body, just his head on the statue. So what is the message from Cosimo to his fiancée? I'll be a great husband. I love music and poetry. I don't get painted nude, but if I did, you'll see that I have the body of a Greek statue. And I love you so much, I'd go to hell and back for you. One other thing. Do you see this little violin bow here? Is it a symbol? Is he suggesting that they might have a lot of children, if you get my meaning? They did, in fact, have 11 children. So this painting brings it all together. Wealthy people creating art about themselves, and also referencing the ancient world of Greece and Rome. We've really completed our journey from the medieval to the Renaissance, but I wanted to share a post-Renaissance work with you. It's one of the most famous things in the museum, and it draws on some of the themes we've been exploring. As we walk back to Gallery 358 to see it, I'll tell you a story from Greek mythology, and as I do, we'll see some slides of things that will pass along the way to our artwork. The story starts when the world was being created by the Greek gods, and as each creature was created, it was given some power for survival: sharp teeth, claws, wings, and each was given some protection against the elements: fur, a thick hide, or the ability to burrow underground. But when it came time for the creation of humans, all of the good properties had been given out, and humans were left naked with no protection. One of the Greek gods, Prometheus, took pity on humans and stole fire from Zeus, the king of the gods. Zeus was furious, worried, perhaps rightly as it has turned out, that humans would become too powerful. Once a gift had been given by the gods, however, it couldn't be taken back. So the heat of his rage turned on Prometheus. Zeus chained Prometheus to this mountain, and each day sent his eagle to tear out Prometheus's liver. Since Prometheus was a god who could not die, the next day the liver grew back, and the torture began all over again. And look at how Prometheus and the eagle are glowering at each other in this 7-foot-tall painting by the great artist of the 1600s, Peter Paul Rubens. In the corner of the picture, you can see the fire, which is a sign to tell you that this is the story of Prometheus. As you can see, it's a dramatic picture with bold contrasts of light and dark. Sometimes it's interesting to look at the geometry of a painting. The lines in this painting, for example, form a triangle, which is a very stable shape, so this painting seems grounded. With the Prometheus painting, we get these very strong diagonal lines in the bird, the man, and in the torch. So the painting is unstable, which makes it much more dramatic, as though the figures are going to slide off the canvas and spill out on the floor right in front of us. You might think this painting is all about a Greek myth, but there's a clue here that it may not be that simple. The Greek myth says that the eagle ate Prometheus's liver. Now, all of you pre-med students probably know that this wound is nowhere near the liver, and Rubens would have known that from watching autopsies. But if you look at almost any picture of Jesus on the cross, you will notice that Jesus always has a wound on his right side from where he was pierced by a spear while he was on the cross. And that wound is exactly where Prometheus' wound is. Now, look at this very famous picture of the Last Judgment by Michelangelo. Rubens had seen this in Rome, and many people would have seen prints and copies of it. Here, we have a very muscular Jesus, and he's holding his arms and legs in a very particular way. Do you see a resemblance to Prometheus? Their bodies are very similar. Now, let's flip Prometheus upside down, and the comparison becomes even clearer, and the scar on Jesus' side lines up with the wound from the eagle. So what does this mean? Well, we can see the influence of the Renaissance. First, it's a picture based in Greek mythology, as we saw in the Renaissance, but it also has Christian themes which are strong in the Renaissance as well. Prometheus is like Jesus. He is a divine figure who suffers in order to save humankind. So that's the end of our journey, but just for a moment, let's review some of the images that we've seen. And thank you for joining me. When you come to the museum, you'll see these works are much more spectacular when you see them in person. And of course, there's so much more to see as well. Visit the description of this YouTube to see pictures and information about the works we've seen, and to learn about my other YouTube videos about the great art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art.